The silk cord around her wrists was the finest thing Eleanor Ashford had worn in 3 years. She sat in the corner of the hired carriage with her hands folded in her lap, as her mother had always instructed, quietly, decorously, taking up as little space as possible. The cobblestones of St. James's Street rattled beneath the wheels. Through a crack in the window came the smell of expensive tobacco, damp wool, and something else. Something she could not name, but which settled uneasily in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. She told herself it was nerves. She had been telling herself that for the better part of an hour. Her mother had called it an opportunity. A position, she had said, with a household of significant means. Someone is willing to provide for you, Eleanor. Be grateful for once in your life. And Eleanor, who had learned long ago that her mother's kindness always arrived wrapped in a warning, had dressed in her best ivory muslin, allowed the maid to pin her dark hair, and climbed into the carriage without protest. The bruise beneath her left eye, a reminder of Tuesday's dinner argument, had been powdered over carefully. Her mother was nothing if not thorough. The carriage slowed. The driver did not announce their arrival. He simply opened the door, and a man Eleanor had never seen, broad-shouldered, expressionless, wearing the livery of no household she recognized, held out his hand to assist her down. She stepped onto the pavement. The building before her had no signboard, no nameplate, no indication whatsoever of the respectable employment agency her mother had described. Only a black door, a single brass handle, and 2 tall windows with their curtains drawn against the January night. From somewhere inside came the low murmur of many male voices, and the sound, so ordinary, so utterly wrong in this context, made something cold move through her like a draft beneath a door. She turned back to the carriage. It was already pulling away. And in the moment before it disappeared around the corner, Eleanor saw quite clearly her mother's face in the window, watching her with an expression that was not worry, was not guilt, was not the face of a woman who had just sent her daughter to a new life. It was the face of a woman who had just settled an account. If you wish to know what became of Miss Eleanor Ashford, whether she survived what her own mother had arranged for her, and what the most feared Duke in London did when he discovered the truth, stay with me until the final word. And when you do, leave a comment telling me which city you are watching from. I want to know how far Eleanor's story travels. They did not explain what the building was. They did not need to. The man who had helped her from the carriage guided Eleanor through the black door and into a narrow corridor that smelled of beeswax candles and brandy and the particular mustiness of old money operating in private spaces. The wallpaper was dark green. The carpet was thick enough to swallow sound. And the sound that reached her anyway, that low, layered murmur of men's voices, grew louder as they turned a corner and approached a set of double doors, behind which something was very clearly underway. Eleanor stopped walking. The man behind her did not push her. He simply waited, as though she had all the time in the world and none of it mattered. "What is this place?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She had trained it to be. "Mr. Greaves' establishment," he said. "You've been expected." She had been expected. Not interviewed, not introduced, not given the dignity of a name. Expected, like a parcel, like a bill come due. The doors opened. The room beyond was not large. Perhaps 40 men occupied it, some standing, some seated on low chairs, arranged in loose rows, facing a raised platform at the far end. The lighting came entirely from candles, a chandelier overhead, and dozens of tapers set into iron holders along the walls, so that the entire room flickered and breathed with amber light. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the particular tension that settles over a room full of men who are waiting for something they want. On the platform stood a small man with a clerk's hands and a showman's posture, holding a leather-bound ledger. His name, she would later learn, was Grieve, and he had earned it. No one looked at Eleanor when she entered, not immediately. They were studying the ledger or their drinks, or one another with the calculating regard of men accustomed to transactions. And then, one by one, they did look. And the quality of the silence that followed was unlike any silence Eleanor had experienced in 24 years of careful living. It was the silence of appraisal. She did not move, could not. Her feet had made their own decision about what her mind had not yet fully understood, and the decision was stillness. The same stillness she had learned at 12 years old when her mother's moods turned without warning. The same stillness that had kept her safe and small and surviving for longer than she could count. Grieve consulted his ledger. He did not look at her directly. He looked at the page, then at the room, and said quite pleasantly, as though announcing a particularly fine vintage, "Lot 14, Miss E. Ashford, 24 years of age, educated, presentable, in good health?" He paused. "We will open the bidding at 50 guineas. Eleanor Ashford had been told many things in her life that were difficult to absorb, that her father's creditors had seized the family estate, that her season had been quietly cancelled for reasons her mother refused to specify, so that her small inheritance, her grandmother's bequest, the only thing that had ever been entirely her own, had been attended to on her behalf. But nothing, not one single moment in 24 years, had prepared her for hearing her own name announced at auction. Her knees did not buckle. She would be proud of that later. She turned, slowly, deliberately, and looked up at the gallery that ran along the back wall of the room. She had sensed movement up there without quite seeing it, some peripheral awareness of a figure in the shadows. And when she looked, she found exactly what the worst part of her had known she would find. Her mother stood at the gallery rail in her best burgundy silk gown, a glass of wine in one gloved hand, watching the proceedings below with the calm satisfaction of someone who has worked very hard toward a particular outcome and is now permitting herself the pleasure of watching it arrive. Lady Constance Ashford was a beautiful woman. She had always been a beautiful woman. Even now, even here in this room, doing this thing, her expression was composed, her posture elegant, her smile a faint and private thing that had fooled half of London society for 20 years. Eleanor looked at her mother. Her mother looked back. And then Lady Constance Ashford, with the serenity of a woman who has already made her peace with a decision, looked away. It was the smallest gesture in the world. One turn of a head. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. It was the end of everything Eleanor had ever allowed herself to believe about who her mother was. The bidding had begun around her like weather, something happening at a distance that she was standing in the middle of, getting wet, unable to process the fact of the rain. She heard numbers. She heard voices. She kept her spine straight because it was the only thing she could control, and she needed, desperately, to control something. 60 guineas. 75. 100. She fixed her eyes on a point on the far wall and breathed, and then a voice she had not heard before cut through the room. Not loud, not theatrical, not raised above the proceedings by even one unnecessary degree of volume, and said simply, 200. Everything stopped. Not figuratively. The room actually, physically, rearranged itself in response to that voice. Men shifted, turned, they murmured to one another in that rapid undertone of people who have just been reminded that there is a larger predator in the room than they had accounted for. Grieve looked up from his ledger. His pen hovered. "Your Grace," he said, with a deference that was almost comical in its completeness. 200 guineas. Do we have—" No one bid against it. They said the Duke of Ashford had broken 3 men financially, though they were careful about the word broken, because broken implied something that had once been whole and might yet be repaired, and the 3 men in question had not been repaired. They had simply ceased to appear in the places they had previously occupied, and were spoken of thereafter in the past tense. Sebastian Crane, Duke of Ashford, known, in the particular way that London nicknames its most formidable inhabitants, as the Gravestone Duke, had not sought the reputation. He had simply conducted his affairs with a precision that left no room for the customary social softening that most men relied on to cushion their consequences. If he said he would do something, he did it. If he said something was finished, it was finished. He was not cruel. He was simply exact, and exactness in a world that ran on vagueness and implication felt very much like cruelty to the people on the receiving end of it. He was 32 years old. He had dark hair worn without powder, unfashionable, but the Duke had opinions about fashion that fashion had long since stopped arguing with. His jaw was angular, his bearing the kind that comes not from instruction, but from years of refusing to let the world see you flinch. He had gray eyes the color of the Thames in winter, and they moved through a room with the unhurried attention of someone who misses nothing and files everything for later use. He had come to Grieve's establishment for a debt instrument, a paper transaction, 20 minutes of business, then out again. He had not come for the auction, had barely glanced at the schedule when it was mentioned, had stepped into the back of the room with the intention of waiting until Grieve was available and then conducting his actual purpose. He had heard the bidding begin. He had not paid it particular attention. He had looked up once as the numbers climbed, as the particular silence of men assessing something played out in the room before him, and he had seen her. She was standing on the platform with her hands clasped, and her spine perfectly straight, and her eyes fixed on the far wall, and the candlelight had done something to the careful powder on her face, dissolved it in that specific way that candlelight dissolves artifice, and beneath it, just beneath the left eye, was a bruise in the particular greenish yellow of injury in the process of healing, which meant there had been a darker bruise before this one, which meant this was not the first. He had not thought about what he was doing. He had simply spoken. 200 guineas. He would examine the decision later, in private, where examining uncomfortable things was at least possible without an audience. For now, and there was only the fact of it, Grieve's deference, the silence of the room, the sound of a gavel falling, and the woman on the platform, who had turned at last to locate the voice that had purchased her, and was looking at him with eyes that were absolutely, devastatingly clear. Not grateful, not frightened, not performing relief or distress for the benefit of the room. Watching him the way she might watch a chess piece moved to a position she had not anticipated, with the careful, calculating attention of someone deciding, very rapidly, what it meant. Sebastian Crane, who had not been surprised by another human being since he was 14 years old, found that he needed a moment. Grieve's man moved toward the platform to direct her toward a side door. The collection procedure presumably, whatever degrading choreography had been arranged for this portion of the evening. The Duke was already crossing the room. He moved with the deliberateness of a man who has decided something and sees no reason to make theater of the deciding. The crowd parted, not dramatically, but by a kind of gravitational inevitability, the way a crowd always parted for Sebastian Crane, and he stepped up onto the platform, and Greaves' man stopped moving, and the room became very quiet again. He stood before her. She was not small, but he was considerably taller, and the candlelight threw his shadow over her in a way that someone else might have found ominous. She looked up at him with those clear, assessing eyes, and did not step back. He did not speak immediately. He looked at her hands, bound at the wrists with a thin silk cord, in the kind of detail that someone had thought elegant, though there was nothing elegant about it. And then he crouched, slightly, and began to work at the knot. His hands were steady. He was wearing gloves, dark leather as shown in the firelight, and he worked the cord loose with methodical care, as though untying a knot was simply the next logical thing to do in a sequence of logical things, and required no more comment than any other ordinary action. The cord fell away. He straightened. She had not moved through any of it, had not withdrawn or protested or made the small, involuntary flinch that people made when he came unexpectedly close. He looked at her wrists, briefly, the way a physician looks, not the way a man looks, and then he looked at her face, and the candlelight was merciless, and he saw. He did not react, not visibly. His expression did not change, his jaw did not tighten. He gave the room absolutely nothing to observe. But something in his gray eyes shifted, some adjustment of temperature, from winter to something colder than winter, the kind of cold that precedes a very long and very particular storm, and he looked away from the bruise and offered her his hand. "You are not a debt, Miss Ashford," he said quietly. "You are a person. Come." She looked at his gloved hand. She looked at his face, and Eleanor Ashford, who had been trained since girlhood never to trust a man's offered hand, who had every reason in the world at this specific moment to trust nothing and no one, made the calculation that this was not a hand offered in acquisition or in ownership or in any of the other guises that power generally used when it reached for something smaller than itself. She placed her hand in his. He helped her down from the platform. He did not look back at the room. He did not address Grieve, who stood with his ledger pressed to his chest and his mouth slightly open. He did not acknowledge the 40 men who watched in the particular silence of people witnessing something they had not expected and were not entirely sure how to process. He simply walked her out, and in the hired carriage, his own, summoned already by some quiet arrangement, when she sat across from him and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and said, in a voice that cost her considerably more than it revealed, "What do you want from me? Your Grace?" He looked at her for a moment and said, "Nothing that is not freely given, which is to say, at present, nothing at all." She did not believe him, but she had nowhere else to be. Ashford House occupied the northeast corner of Berkeley Square with the solid assurance of a building that has never been required to apologize for existing. It was 4 stories of pale stone, its windows tall and unsmiling, its entrance flanked by pillars that had held their position through 4 successive dukes and showed no signs of relenting. Eleanor had passed it once during her aborted season, had looked up at its windows the way one looked at things that belonged to a category of life entirely removed from one's own. She had not imagined standing on its steps at 10 o'clock at night in January, with a fading bruise beneath her eye and silk cord marks on her wrists. Mrs. Hale opened the door before the Duke had raised his hand to knock. She was a woman of considerable size and entirely undisguisable authority, perhaps 60, with white hair pinned severely beneath her cap, and an expression that suggested she had processed stranger arrivals than this one, and had not yet been required to alter her fundamental opinion of human nature. She looked at Eleanor the way Eleanor had not been looked at in years, not with pity, not with assessment, with attention, the kind that sees a person rather than a circumstance. "Mrs. Hale," the Duke said, "Miss Ashford will need a room, the blue suite, a fire and supper if anything is available. And I should like Dr. Blackwell sent for, if he is willing." "I'll send Thomas directly," Mrs. Hale said, already moving. Then, to Eleanor, checked with a briskness that was somehow warmer than most people's gentleness, "Come along then. The fire will be up in 10 minutes. She followed. She had the bewildering sensation of being carried forward by events that had not yet asked her permission to occur, which was not, she reflected, entirely unlike the events of the preceding 2 hours, except that something about the direction had fundamentally altered. The blue suite was on the 2nd floor. It was not a grand set of rooms, but it was entirely comfortable. A sitting room with 2 chairs before a fireplace, a bedroom with a 4-poster hung with blue damask, and a dressing room beyond. The fire was indeed up in 10 minutes, precisely as promised. A tray appeared with cold chicken and bread and a pot of tea, and Mrs. Hale set it on the table without commentary and without the particular careful silence of someone trying very hard not to say something. "The doctor will be half an hour," she said. "You needn't see him tonight if you prefer not to." Eleanor stopped. The sentence had not been finished because she did not know what she wanted, and she was so unaccustomed to being asked that the question had arrived like a word in a foreign language, recognizable in shape but requiring a moment of translation. "I will see him," she said finally. "Thank you." Mrs. Hale nodded and moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "There is a key on the mantelpiece," she said. "For the outer door of the suite. The lock is a good one." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. After she left, Eleanor stood in the sitting room and listened to the fire and the silence of a house that was, by every external measurement, the household of the most intimidating man in London. Then she crossed to the mantelpiece and picked up the key. It was heavy and solid in her palm, the kind of key made for a lock that means what it says. A knock at the outer door. She startled. "Miss Ashford." The Duke's voice, quiet, as it had been in the auction room. "I will not enter. I wished only to tell you, Dr. Blackwell is a good man. He will not ask questions you do not wish to answer, and he has my complete confidence regarding discretion." A pause. "The key is yours. I have no copy." She stood very still with the key in her hand. She heard his footsteps retreat down the corridor. She waited until they had entirely disappeared. Then she went to the outer door and locked it. She tried it once, twice. A third time, pressing the handle down with the full weight of her attention, testing it as she had learned to test everything in her life. Not out of panic, but out of the simple, necessary understanding that safety must always be verified rather than assumed. It held. She stood with her forehead briefly against the wood of the door, breathing. Then she went and ate every bite of the cold chicken, because she had not eaten since morning, and her body, at least, had not lost its practical good sense. Dr. Blackwell arrived precisely when promised, examined her with the methodical care of a man who had seen worse, and would not be theatrical about what he found, and documented what was visible. 2 older bruises, 1 healed rib, then the fresh mark below her eye. In a notebook he said he would retain without question or publication. "You are otherwise in reasonable health," he told her, repacking his bag with unhurried efficiency. "The rib was healing incorrectly, but it will settle properly now if you rest it. The bruising should clear in a fortnight." "Thank you," she said. He paused at the door. He was a mild-looking man with spectacles and the kind of face that inspired the immediate desire to tell him things. "Miss Ashford," he said, "if you require anything, at any hour, you have only to send to my address. The Duke's household has it." She thanked him again. When he left, she sat in the chair by the fire for a long time, not doing anything in particular, simply sitting in a room she had been given the key to, and slowly, very slowly, the way ice melts rather than the way ice breaks, letting her shoulders come down from where they had been for the past several years. She did not sleep well. Old habits do not untangle in one night simply because the environment has changed. She lay in the blue damask bed and listened to the strange sounds of the house, the settling of old timbers, a clock on the landing, rain beginning somewhere around 2 in the morning and falling steadily until dawn. And her mind turned things over with the methodical persistence of a woman who does her thinking at night, because daytime has never been safe enough for it. Who was Sebastian Crane, and what did he actually want? No man bid 200 guineas at an auction and wanted nothing. The phrase, "nothing that is not freely given," was elegant, but elegance was not the same as truth, and she had been deceived by elegance before. She would watch, she would wait, she would be careful. That, at least, was familiar ground. Morning brought Mrs. Hale with tea and toast, and the intelligence that the Duke would be pleased to receive her in the library at 10 o'clock, should she wish to come down, and that she was under no obligation to do anything at all she did not wish to do. That last part had been added, Eleanor suspected, on instruction. She came down at 10. The library was on the ground floor, a high-ceilinged room with shelves on every wall and a desk near the window that overlooked the garden, gray and January dormant, the trees bare against a white sky. The Duke was at the desk when she entered, writing something, and he finished the sentence before he looked up, which she appreciated, though in a detached sort of way, because it suggested her arrival was not an emergency requiring the performance of attention. He stood. He gestured to the chair across from his. She sat. He sat. "How are you this morning?" he asked. "Better than last evening," she said, which is not entirely a compliment to last evening. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the approximate region of where a smile might occur in a person who had not entirely abandoned the habit. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "about what I intend and what I do not." "You do," she agreed. He regarded her with the gray-eyed attention she was beginning to recognize as his particular manner of giving something its due weight. Then he said, "You are not here as a purchase. You are here because I removed you from a situation that was being conducted under fraudulent premises. A position, I understand, your mother described to you as employment." She kept her expression still. "Yes." The arrangement she made with Grieve was to satisfy a debt of 160 guineas owed to a man named Fitch, a moneylender who operates, among other things, those premises. I know Fitch. He is not a man of patience, and the outcomes available to women in his establishment are limited and unpleasant. He paused. "I did not bid in order to own you, Miss Ashford," I bid in order to end the auction. That is the whole of it." She listened to this. She examined it from several angles, the way you examine a gift for a mechanism. "And now," she said, "now you may stay here under my protection, say for as long as you require a safe place. You will have every courtesy afforded to a guest. No one in this household will expect anything of you beyond reasonable behavior, and you will find that standard not unreasonably demanding." He picked up his pen, then set it down again. A gesture, she realized, that meant he was not quite finished. "When you are ready to discuss what comes next, your options, your situation, your wishes regarding your mother, I am available to that conversation. I am in no hurry." She sat for a moment. "You are a very strange man," she said, "for a duke." "So I am frequently told," he said. "It has not yet caused me significant difficulty." She almost smiled. She stopped herself, because she did not yet know what it would cost her. Lord Cavendish arrived 3 days later with the air of a man who has heard a great many interesting rumors and has come in person to determine their accuracy. He was perhaps 35, sandy-haired, with a face that habitually arranged itself into an expression of friendly amusement. The kind of face that people immediately trusted and subsequently discovered had been paying considerably more attention than its expression suggested. He was, Eleanor gathered from Mrs. Hale's commentary, and the 2 hushed sentences the Duke had offered on the subject, Sebastian Crane's oldest friend. Possibly his only friend, in the proper sense of the word. Cavendish presented himself in the library where Eleanor was reading. She had asked, tentatively, if she might use the library, and the Duke had said yes, with the faint surprise of someone who had not expected to be asked for permission to use something that was already available. And he bowed with considerable elegance and said, "Miss Ashford, I am Cavendish. I have come to check that Sebastian has not managed to make the house feel like a military campaign, and that you have been fed." "Both conditions are adequately met," she said. "Excellent. He does sometimes forget that other people require warmth. Not heat, he's very good about fires, but the conversational equivalent." "Lord Cavendish," the Duke said from the doorway, in a tone that suggested he had been there for approximately 1 sentence longer than Cavendish had known. "You are describing me to a woman I am attempting to reassure. Well, I would ask you to consider whether your current approach is helpful." "I am being entirely helpful," Cavendish said. "I am establishing that you are human. It is a message that requires periodic reinforcement." Eleanor looked between the 2 of them. The Duke's expression had not shifted. Cavendish's had arranged itself into the particular innocence of someone who knows they are being tolerated and plans to make the most of it. She felt, for the first time since Tuesday, the urge to laugh. She kept it down, but it was there, small and stubborn and entirely unexpected, like a crocus in January. Cavendish stayed for lunch. He was, Eleanor discovered, an exceptionally good source of information, because he offered it without the self-consciousness of someone who thinks they are revealing something dangerous. He spoke about the Duke with the comfortable frankness of long acquaintance, and what emerged was a portrait considerably more layered than the gravestone Duke of London's collective imagination. He was sent away at 14, Cavendish said, in the middle of a discussion about entirely something else, with the conversational abruptness of a man who has decided to say a thing and sees no reason to build to it gradually. His father arranged a political alliance with a family in the north. Sebastian was, I suppose given is the word, though it doesn't cover it properly. He came back at 18. He never spoke of it. But he was different afterward. in the way that things are different after they've been tested past their designed capacity. The Duke, seated across the table, did not look up from his plate. He did not say, "I know what you felt on that platform." He did not say, "I understand the particular humiliation of being used as currency in another person's transaction." He did not say anything at all. He reached across the table and refilled her wineglass. It was such a small gesture, an entirely ordinary, domestic, unremarkable gesture. And yet Eleanor sat with it in her chest for the rest of the afternoon, turning it over. The solicitor arrived on the 5th morning. Eleanor heard him from the hallway. She had been on her way to the library. She had adopted a morning routine with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned that structure is the best available armor against uncertainty, when a commotion at the front door reached her. Not a loud commotion, the sort of quiet, insistent commotion that people with social standing deploy when they wish to be admitted somewhere they are not welcome. She stopped on the landing. Below, in the entrance hall, the Duke's butler was engaging with a man who held a document case and wore the expression of someone who has been sent to do an unpleasant thing and has decided to perform thoroughness as a substitute for conscience. "I represent Lady Constance Ashford," the man said. "I am here to collect her daughter. There is a legal instrument." "One moment." The butler disappeared. The Duke appeared in the hall perhaps 30 seconds later. He was in his morning coat without the full formality of his public dress, which made him, if anything, more formidable, since the formal dress could be attributed to display, but this version was simply him, and it was considerable. He looked at the solicitor the way he looked at everything, with complete, unhurried attention. "You have a document," the Duke said. It was not a question. The solicitor produced it. The Duke read it. He handed it back. "Miss Ashford is under my protection," he said. "If Lady Constance wishes to discuss the matter further, she may do so with my solicitor, or with me directly. I would advise the former." The solicitor opened his mouth. "That concludes our business," the Duke said. The solicitor left without another word. The door closed behind him with the well-bred firmness of a door that has been managed by a skilled butler for 40 years and has developed its own opinions about unwanted visitors. Eleanor stood on the landing and breathed. She had spent 24 years waiting for someone to stand between her and whatever her mother sent next. She had stopped waiting approximately 3 years ago, because waiting for a thing that does not come is simply a slower form of loss. She had not restarted the wait. She had simply, without planning to, stumbled into a house where it was already done. She went to the library. She sat down. She opened her book. She did not read a single word of it for the next 40 minutes, and she did not particularly mind. Cavendish reappeared 4 days later with news, delivered with his customary mixture of precision and studied carelessness. Lady Constance had gone to the press. The scandal sheet was called The Morning Whisper, a publication that occupied the particular journalistic territory between speculation and accusation, and which had made its fortune printing the former while implying the latter. The item it ran was 3 paragraphs, anonymous, noting that a young woman of good family had been seen entering Ashford House and had not been seen leaving, and drawing the conclusions available to a readership that had been trained to draw them. "She's filed a petition as well," Cavendish said, without preamble, setting the folded sheet on the desk between them. "Claims Eleanor is, and I want to be accurate here, in a state of mental agitation inconsistent with the proper management of her own affairs. She's asking for guardianship restored to herself, Eleanor looked at the paper. She looked at the Duke. He was looking at the paper with an expression she was beginning to learn to read, the very slight tightening around the eyes that, in another man, would have been a visible reaction. "She was at the Hargreaves Musicale last Tuesday," Cavendish continued, leaning back in his chair. "Performed Grief to perfection, I'm told. Several patronesses of Almack's are now deeply concerned about your welfare, Eleanor." Lady Jersey reportedly wept. "Lady Jersey," Eleanor said, "has never in her life wept over anything that did not directly affect Lady Jersey." Cavendish looked at her with the satisfied expression of a man who has suspected someone of wit for days and has just had it confirmed. "The petition will not succeed," the Duke said. "I have already spoken with my solicitor. The grounds are insufficient, and the evidence is her own word, which will be tested against available documentation." He paused. "However, the scandal sheet is a different matter. It is designed to isolate you, to ensure that wherever you go, the story precedes you, which means the most effective answer is visibility." "You want me to be seen?" Eleanor said. "I want you to have the choice," he said. "Whether to be seen is yours. I would not arrange your public reappearance without your agreement." She sat with that for a moment. The choice. The word kept appearing in her life in this house like something that had been mislaid for years and was now turning up in unexpected drawers. "Lady Cavendish's ball," Cavendish offered, with the helpful air of a man who has already thought several steps ahead and is waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same point. "End of the month. The most attended event of the season thus far. Half of London will be there, including, I would wager, Lady Constance." Eleanor looked at the Duke. He looked back at her, grey eyes steady, waiting. "I will need a gown," she said. Lord Cavendish, it emerged, had been quietly busy in the weeks since Eleanor's arrival at Ashford House, not in any theatrical or obviously investigative manner, but in the way that a man with many acquaintances, a sharp memory, and no particular aversion to paperwork can be busy, which is to say, thoroughly and without drawing attention to it. He had spoken with two of Lady Constance's former solicitors, so one of whom had left her employ under circumstances he described as a difference of professional conscience, and the other of whom was simply old and tired and had been keeping careful records for 20 years. He had visited the offices of a clerk at Chancery who managed inheritance filings. He had spoken with the matron of a small lying-in hospital in Whitechapel, who remembered, with considerable clarity, treating a young woman with the name Ashford some years previous, a young woman who had told the matron that her injuries were the result of a fall. "There is an inheritance clause," Cavendish said, spreading the papers across the library table with the precision of a man who understands that information, properly arranged, is more powerful than any display of emotion. "Filed privately 2 years ago. The Ashford family's secondary estate in Hampshire, £40,000 and the property, was entailed away from Eleanor's father's line when the debts became public. But there is a rider. A secondary clause registered under Lady Constance's instruction, which provides that should Eleanor predecease her mother without issue, the estate reverts entirely to Lady Constance's control." The room was quiet. "She ensured her daughter's death," Eleanor said. Her voice was entirely steady. She was rather proud of it. "Not precisely," Cavendish said, with the care of a man who is being accurate rather than gentle. "She arranged for her daughter's death to be profitable. There is a distinction. Both are monstrous, but the law treats them differently. And Greaves' establishment? A letter, in Lady Constance's own hand, to Fitch, and dated 6 weeks before you were taken there." Cavendish slid it across the table. "She describes you as the most convenient form of settlement available to me at present, and requests that the arrangement be conducted with minimal disruption." She was not expecting the Duke's involvement. She was expecting something quieter, the Duke said. He had been standing at the window for the past several minutes, very still, in the way that he was still when he was managing something beneath his surface with considerable deliberateness. "Yes," Cavendish said. "Take it to Alderman Forsyth," the Duke said, "and to Pemberton and Croft. Both owe me the hearing." He turned from the window. "Not a public proceeding. Not yet. A private audience, a magistrate, and the documentation. I want it done correctly." "Methodically," Cavendish said. "She completely," the Duke said. Eleanor looked at the letter in her mother's handwriting. Elegant even now, the loops and curves of a woman who had been complimented on her penmanship since girlhood, and felt something shift inside her chest that was not grief exactly, and was not anger exactly, but was the final closing of a door she had been holding partly open for longer than she should have. She pushed the letter back across the table. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "Speak," the Duke said. "When the time comes, your testimony in your own words will carry more weight than any document." She nodded. "I can do that," she said, and meant it. Lady Cavendish's ball was held on the last Friday of January in a house on Grosvenor Square that had been made available for the purpose and had been transformed, in the way that sufficient money and adequate notice can transform almost anything, into a glittering approximation of a summer evening in the middle of winter. Eleanor's gown was midnight blue, not the pale, apologetic blue of a woman trying not to be noticed, but the deep, uncompromising blue of a winter sky at the moment before dawn, a color that arrived before you and required you to have an opinion about it. Mrs. Hale's dressmaker, a small, fierce woman named Marguerite who had views about fabric that she expressed without invitation, had fitted it in 2 days. It required no powder to conceal anything. Eleanor had decided quietly and finally that she was done with powder. The Duke collected her from the drawing room at 9:30. He was in formal dress, the black coat and white cravat of a man who wears these things as a matter of function rather than display, which makes them, paradoxically, more elegant. And he looked at her in the midnight blue and said, "You will be the most visible person in the room." "That," she said, "is rather the point." "Yes," he agreed. "I thought it might be." They arrived fashionably late. Not so late as to be theatrical, but late enough that the room was full and the heads that turned when they entered turned against a backdrop of established social momentum, which meant the turning was more noticeable and the turning was significant. Eleanor Ashford, reported missing and ruined and mentally agitated, arriving at the most attended ball of the season on the arm of the Duke of Ashford. She was wearing midnight blue and no concealing powder, and an expression of absolute composure. She had practiced the composure for 3 days. It felt by now almost real. She located her mother within 4 minutes of entering the ballroom. Lady Constance was standing near the refreshment table in pale gray silk, appropriately muted for a woman in publicized distress over her missing daughter, and she was mid-conversation with 2 patronesses and a viscountess, and her back was to the door. The viscountess saw Eleanor first. Her expression changed, and that change rippled through the small group like a stone dropped in still water, and Lady Constance turned. The color drained from her mother's face. Not dramatically, Lady Constance was too accomplished for drama, but visibly, The way color leaves a thing when the warmth that sustained it has been suddenly removed. She had prepared for many contingencies. She had prepared her grief, her petition, her press narrative, her solicitor. She had not prepared for this, for her daughter in midnight blue, standing in a doorway she should not have been able to reach. For a moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, Lady Constance's face was entirely honest, and what it showed was not guilt, was not remorse, was not even fear. It was fury. Cold, specific, calculating fury. The fury of a plan that has encountered an obstacle it was not designed to accommodate. Then the mask came back. But Eleanor had seen, and more importantly, so had the Viscountess. Lady Constance detached herself from the group and crossed the ballroom with the measured grace of a woman conducting a reconciliation, her arms slightly open, her expression rearranged into something approaching maternal anguish. Eleanor. Her voice was low, warm, designed to be heard only by the nearest listeners, which meant approximately 12 people, all of whom were paying close attention. My dearest girl, I have been so... Good evening, Lady Constance, Eleanor said. Not mother, not mama. Not any of the words that implied the relationship was what her mother had spent the last 3 weeks performing it to be. Lady Constance's outstretched hands faltered. She recovered. You look very well, darling. I am so relieved. I have been beside myself with... I am well, Eleanor said. I have been well for some time. She well-housed, well-fed, and in the company of people who have treated me with considerably more courtesy than I have been accustomed to. The nearest 12 people became 20. The music continued, but it was doing so for its own satisfaction, because no one in the immediate vicinity was listening to it. Eleanor, her mother said, and now the warmth in her voice had acquired the particular edge of a woman whose patience has been underestimated. You are not well. Anyone can see that this situation has distressed you, and I understand completely. You have been misled, manipulated, and I do not for one moment blame you. You wrote a letter, Eleanor said, to a man named Fitch, 6 weeks before I was taken to his establishment. I have read it. The 20 became 30. The music finished a passage and in the beat before the next began, the silence was absolute. Lady Constance looked at her daughter, and for the second time in one evening, the mask slipped, not entirely, not irreparably, but enough. Enough that the Viscountess, standing 3 feet away, drew a small, audible breath. I think, said Lord Cavendish, appearing at Eleanor's other side with the serenity of a man who has positioned himself precisely where he intended to be, that this conversation might benefit from a more formal setting. As it happens, Alderman Forsyth and 2 members of Parliament are in the card room. I wonder, Lady Constance, whether you might be willing to join them. He said it pleasantly. He said it the way you say something when the alternative is already arranged, and the question is purely courtesy. Lady Constance looked at the growing circle of onlookers. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the Duke, who had not moved, had not spoken, had simply stood at Eleanor's side with the patient immovability of a man who has all evening. She straightened her spine. She lifted her chin. Of course, she said, and walked with Lord Cavendish to the card room, because there was nothing else to do, and because Lady Constance Ashford had always understood, in the deepest part of her, that a strategic retreat was not the same as a defeat. She was wrong about that, but she would not know it yet. The card room had been cleared. Alderman Forsyth was a compact man, with the serious face of someone who has spent many years listening to things people would rather not have heard, and has been made neither cynical nor naive by the experience. The two members of Parliament, Pemberton and Croft, both of them men who owed the Duke favors that Cavendish had described as of the unspecified but enduring variety, sat to one side with the expressions of men who are witnessing something significant and are conscious of the fact. Lord Cavendish laid the documents on the table one at a time. He narrated each one in the measured, unoratorical tone of a man presenting information rather than performing an argument. The letter to Fitch, the inheritance clause, the medical records retrieved from the lying-in hospital, the financial record showing the debt and its arrangement. Lady Constance sat across the table with her solicitor, summoned, somehow, within 20 minutes. She had planned for many contingencies, and this had been one of them. And her expression was contained, professional, entirely the face of a woman preparing to dispute. Alderman Forsyth read each document carefully. He read them in silence. He set them in a neat stack to his right. Then he turned to Eleanor. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I would like to hear from you directly, if you are willing." She had been sitting quietly throughout Cavendish's presentation. She was wearing midnight blue and she had not replaced the powder, and her hands, folded on the table before her, were entirely still. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." She spoke for 20 minutes. She did not perform. She did not weep. She did not modulate her voice for effect or pause for dramatic emphasis, or arrange her suffering into anything more palatable than the plain shape it occupied. She stated what had happened, when it had happened, in what sequence. She described the carriage and the building, and the smell of brandy and expensive tobacco, and the sound of a gavel and her mother's face in the gallery above, watching with the satisfaction of a settled account. She described the years before it, the controlled finances, the cancelled season, the inheritance she had never been permitted to access, the injuries that had been explained as accidents to doctors who had been, she now understood, selected for their incuriosity. She described all of it in the quiet, precise, unremarkable voice of someone reporting facts, because they were facts, and facts do not require ornamentation. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Alderman Forsyth looked at Lady Constance. Lady Constance's solicitor leaned in and murmured something. Lady Constance listened. She looked at the documents. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at the two members of Parliament, who were looking at her with expressions that would not be easily altered by any subsequent social performance. She looked finally at the alderman. "I will require time to confer with my solicitor," she said. "Of course," Alderman Forsyth said. "You have until tomorrow morning, at which point I will be filing a formal report with the court." Lady Constance rose. She walked to the door. She did not look at Eleanor. She did not look at Eleanor because if she had looked at Eleanor, she would have seen what Eleanor had become in this room, in this hour, in these 20 minutes of plain fact. And whatever Lady Constance Ashford was or was not, she was not, in the end, quite equal to that sight. The door closed behind her. Eleanor breathed. Lady Constance Ashford's life did not collapse in a single moment. This was not the way it happened, and Eleanor would not have wished it to happen that way, because a single dramatic collapse can be survived, can be reframed, can be used, can be turned into a narrative of persecution that sustains its subject for years. What happened instead was systematic, and it was the systematicness that made it permanent. The alderman's report triggered an investigation by the Chancery Court into the inheritance clause, a proceeding that was not public and was therefore not useful to Lady Constance as a platform for sympathy. The Foundation's charity work, it emerged under examination, had been sustained almost entirely by donations that Lady Constance had directed toward her own comfort, with a creative bookkeeping practice that her solicitor, under questioning, declined to defend. 3 of her closest social allies, women who had wept at the musicale and signed the petition and written letters of support, quietly ceased their association when they understood that association was no longer advantageous. The scandal sheet retracted its item about Eleanor. It did not apologize. Scandal sheets do not apologize. But it printed a small correction in a corner of page 3 that, in context, said everything. Lady Constance appeared once at Ashford House. She did not request a meeting with Eleanor. She requested a meeting with the Duke. He received her in his study, and Cavendish, who positioned himself in the adjacent sitting room with the door slightly ajar, reported afterward that she had spoken for 8 minutes, and he had spoken for 45 seconds. What he said was, "The matter is with the court. I recommend you direct any further communication to Alderman Forsyth's office." She left. She did not return. 3 weeks after the ball, Lady Constance Ashford's solicitor submitted to the court a signed statement. 11 pages in her own hand, confirming the debt arrangement, the instruction to Fitch, and the existence of the inheritance clause. In exchange, the criminal proceedings were reduced to a civil matter. Her fortune was substantially redirected to a court-administered trust, and she was required to leave London for a period of no less than 3 years. She went to a village in Derbyshire. She was not happy there. But happiness had never been the point of the exercise, and Eleanor had long since stopped measuring her own peace against her mother's satisfaction. The inheritance, the Hampshire estate, the £40,000, was released to Eleanor. She sat with the letter from the court solicitor for a long time, in the library of Ashford House, on a morning in February, when the garden outside was beginning to show the very first signs of its eventual recovery from winter. £40,000. She was 24 years old. She had never managed more than 5 shillings at one time in her own name. She was not overwhelmed. She was something she had never expected to be, which was ready. She told the Duke what she intended to do with it over dinner, approximately 3 minutes after she had finished deciding. He listened without interrupting, which was not, she had learned, a passive behavior in him, but an active one. He listened the way other people argued, with the full weight of his attention. "A school," she said. "Not the fashionable kind. Not the kind that teaches accomplishments to daughters of the comfortable classes. A school for women in Cheapside, women who have no legal recourse, no family support, no access to the instruments that might change their circumstances. Reading, writing, and the law as it pertains to their own situations, practical skills, counsel." She paused. "A refuge alongside it. A place to be safe while they decide what comes next. The kind of place I would have given a great deal to know existed 3 years ago." The Duke was quiet for a moment. "How much will you keep for yourself?" he asked. It was, she thought, exactly the right question. Not whether she should do it, not whether it was wise, not whether she had considered the practical challenges, but whether she had remembered to include herself in the provision. "Enough," she said. "I have been calculating." "Good," he said. And that was the end of the discussion. She did not know, would not know for some time, that the next morning he spoke with an architect he knew, a man who worked in the Cheapside area and understood its specific practical requirements. and arranged for an assessment of 3 available properties. She did not know that he quietly settled the matter of the first 6 months' rent before she had even visited the buildings. She did not know because he did not tell her, and she did not find out until much later. And by that point, it had been done for long enough that the argument she would have made about it had lost most of its available force. He was, in his way, extremely efficient. The Ashford School for Women opened in April in a building on Giltspur Street that had been a print shop, and before that a bakery, and before that something no one could quite remember, with the result that it smelled, very faintly and rather agreeably, of bread and ink. Then Eleanor had not named it after herself. The name had been Cavendish's suggestion, offered with his usual appearance of casualness that concealed careful thinking. Ashford is a name that means something now, he had said. Not because of your mother, because of you. You might as well use it for something it deserves. She had thought about it for 2 days. Then she had written Ashford on the sign and had the sign maker paint it in plain black letters without flourish. The first class had 7 women. 3 of them could not read. One had a broken arm in a cloth sling that she explained, in the careful way Eleanor recognized from long personal practice, as the result of an accident. By the end of the first week, there were 11 women. By the end of the second, 14. Word, Eleanor was discovering, he travels faster in places where people have very little than in places where people have a great deal. Because when something useful becomes available to people who have had access to very little that was useful, they tell one another about it immediately, and they tell everyone they know. Prue Weston, whom Eleanor had briefly encountered at Greaves' establishment on that January evening, a woman who had been there in a similar capacity to Eleanor's own, and had managed, through her own considerable resource, to leave without assistance before the auction began, appeared at the school on the 4th day and offered her services as a reading instructor. She was calm, practical, and had opinions about the arrangement of the classroom furniture that Eleanor respected immediately. I wondered where you had gone, Eleanor said, shocked when they had established that yes, they had indeed seen each other before, and yes, the circumstances had been precisely as each of them remembered. Away, Prue said. Then back, when I heard what you were building. She looked around the room. The long table, the chalkboard, the women seated with their slates, the morning light coming through the windows of what had been a bakery. It's what I would have built, she said, if I had had the means. You have them now, Eleanor said. Help me build it properly. Prue Weston became the school's first superintendent. She was formidable, methodical, and entirely without patience for the particular variety of official condescension that presented itself periodically in the form of clergymen and parish officials who had views about what kinds of education were appropriate for women of limited circumstances. She dealt with them efficiently. Eleanor was deeply grateful. It was a Thursday evening in early May when the Duke found her in the school's garden. The garden was not, strictly speaking, a garden yet. It was a narrow yard at the back of the Giltspur Street building, with 2 struggling elder trees and a stretch of bare earth that Eleanor had instructed should be cleared and planted, though the planting had not yet progressed beyond the planning stage. She was sitting on an unpainted wooden bench with a stack of enrollment letters in her lap, reading them in the last of the evening light, making notes in the margins with a stub of pencil that she had been using since February and had no intention of replacing until it was entirely gone. She heard the door open and did not look up, because she had learned to hear the particular quality of the Duke's footsteps: measured, deliberate, unhurried, and they did not require immediate response. He sat beside her on the bench. She moved the letters slightly to give him room. He did not speak. This was not unusual. They had learned to be comfortable in silence in the way that people learn it when they have spent enough time together, that silence has stopped being a gap requiring filling and has become simply another form of company. She finished the letter she was reading. She noted something in the margin. She moved it to the bottom of the stack. He said, "I did not bid on you to save you, Miss Ashford." She went still. "I bid because I could not imagine walking out of that room and leaving you in it." He was looking at the elder trees, at the pale May sky above the rooftops, at nothing in particular. "The distinction matters to me." She set the letters down on the bench beside her, carefully, because they needed to be somewhere safe and her hands required something to do. "I know," she said. He turned to look at her. She looked back. She had spent 4 months in proximity to this man. 4 months of his deliberate, unhurried attention, of doors that locked from the inside and keys he did not keep copies of wine glasses refilled without being asked, and solicitors turned from doorsteps, and 40 minutes of listening while she told a magistrate the truth of her life. She had spent 4 months watching a man who had been sold by his own father at 14 years old, and had built himself into something formidable from that wreckage. Not because he had forgotten what the wreckage felt like, but because he remembered it precisely, and that memory had shaped everything. She had loved him for at least 2 of those 4 months. She had not said so because there had always been another thing to do, another thing to survive, another thing to build. She acknowledged quietly to herself, very good at finding reasons to do the next necessary thing and to defer the vulnerable one. "Sebastian," she said. She had never called him by his name. She watched him register it. The faintest alteration in his expression, the smallest adjustment of his features, the look of a man who has been waiting for something without permitting himself to acknowledge the waiting. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what it means to build something from nothing, to decide that what happened to you is not the whole of what you are. To choose in the face of considerable evidence to the contrary, to trust." "Yes," he said quietly. "I am not good at it yet," she said. "Trusting. I check the locks. I verify the exits. I wait for the costs to arrive." She turned fully toward him on the bench, the enrollment letters sliding unnoticed to the ground. "But I have been waiting for the cost of you for 4 months. And it has not come. And I have run out of reasons to keep waiting. Sebastian Crane, the Gravestone Duke, the most formidable man in London, who had not been surprised by another human being since he was 14 years old, looked at Eleanor Ashford in the last of the May evening light and said nothing for a moment. Not because he did not have words, but because some things require more than words. And he was not a man who used language as a substitute for meaning. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers closed around hers. Steady, warm, certain. "I have not," he said carefully, "made any promises I did not intend to keep. I do not intend to begin now." She felt the last of the old, careful, necessary vigilance release from somewhere behind her sternum. Not all at once. Not in a rush, but the way a long winter finally ends. Gradually, and then with the undeniable warmth of something that has been coming for some time, and has now simply arrived. "Then I should tell you," she said, "that I love you, and that I intend to continue building this school for the rest of my life, and that I would very much like to do so in the general vicinity of a person who refills my wine glass without being asked and told my mother's solicitor, in 45 seconds, everything that needed to be said." The corner of his mouth moved, and this time it did not stop at the approximate region of a smile. It became one, full, unguarded, the face of a man who has permitted himself at last to want something and to believe he might actually have it. "I love you, Eleanor," he said. I have loved you since you stood on that platform and looked at a room full of men who thought they were purchasing something and gave them absolutely nothing." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, but it came out warm and full and entirely her own. "That," she said, still laughing, still holding his hand in the May evening in the not-yet garden behind the school she had built from her own survival, "is the most Sebastian Crane reason to fall in love with someone that I have ever heard. It is accurate," he said, and his other hand came up to her face. Careful, deliberate, telegraphing every movement as he always did, as he had from the very first night in a room that smelled of brandy and betrayal. And he held her face as though it were a thing worth the holding, and he kissed her with the same steadiness he brought to everything, fully, honestly, and without the smallest intention of stopping. Above them, the elder trees shifted in the May breeze. The enrollment letters lay on the ground, slightly crumpled. The last of the evening light fell across the bare earth that would, eventually, become a garden. The Ashford School for Women educated its first 100 students by September of that year. By the following spring, it had admitted 140. Prue Weston had introduced a legal counsel clinic, attended weekly by a sympathetic barrister who had been persuaded, through a combination of Cavendish's charm and the Duke's unspoken implications, that pro bono work in Cheapside was not only admirable, but professionally advantageous. Lord Cavendish, who had spent the entire winter claiming to have no personal investment in the outcome of anything, attended the school's first anniversary celebration and made a speech that reduced 4 women to tears and prompted the Duke to observe that Cavendish had always been better than he pretended to be at things that mattered. Cavendish denied this vigorously and ate 3 plates of the tea cakes that Rosa, summoned from Ashford House for the occasion, had provided. He appeared to have made peace with this contradiction. Mrs. Hale retired in June. She did not go far. She moved to a small house on the edge of Mayfair from which she visited Ashford House with the comfortable frequency of a woman who has decided that retirement is a concept that applies to official duties rather than to the actual business of being present where one is needed. She was, by unanimous and unstated agreement, always needed. Dr. Blackwell continued his association with the school as its medical advisor, attending twice weekly and treating the work as the most important of his considerable practice, which he told anyone who asked and several people who did not. Lady Constance Ashford remained in Derbyshire. She wrote once to Eleanor, a letter that occupied 4 pages and contained the words, "I am sorry," exactly once, in the 3rd paragraph, surrounded by qualifications that substantially reduced its weight. Eleanor read it carefully. She placed it in a locked box. She did not reply. She had learned at last that some doors are better closed than left partly open. That forgiveness is not the same as permission. That you can refuse to carry a thing without requiring the other person to suffer spectacularly for their wrongs. That justice and vengeance are genuinely different, and that choosing justice is not weakness, but its own particular form of power. She had learned also that safety is not a place you arrive at. It is something you build and keep building with the people who prove themselves worth building with. That trust is not a gift you give once. It is a practice, renewed daily, tested and confirmed and renewed again. These were not small lessons. She did not pretend they were. She taught them in their practical applications, to every woman who came through the doors of the Ashford School. Not from a lectern, and not in those terms, but in the structure of the place itself, in the locks that worked, and the keys that belonged to the person who needed them, and the rooms where decisions could be made without threat, and the plain, enormous, underrated fact of being asked what you wanted and having the answer matter. Sebastian Crane, Duke of Ashford, proposed on a Tuesday in October in the school garden, which by then had become an actual garden. Elder trees, a stretch of lavender along the south wall, a small herb bed that Prue tended with the same methodical care she brought to everything. He did not make a production of it. He sat beside her on the now painted bench and said, in the direct, unpreambled way he had of saying things that were important, "Marry me, Eleanor." She considered for approximately 3 seconds, which was, she would later tell him, the amount of time required to verify that she genuinely wanted it, and not merely the idea of it, which she thought he would appreciate. He said he did. They were married in December, in a small ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square, with Cavendish as witness, Prue Weston in the front row, Mrs. Hale somewhere at the back, attempting to look as though she was not moved, and the school's 7 original students in attendance, dressed in their best clothes and making collectively considerably more noise than the occasion's formality perhaps strictly required. Eleanor Crane, Duchess of Ashford, Cheek walked out of the church into December light with her hand on her husband's arm and the knowledge, solid, verified, earned, that she was precisely where she had chosen to be. Not where circumstance had placed her, not where her mother's transaction had delivered her, not where fear had suggested she might, in the end, be forced to remain. Where she had chosen. She had learned that a woman who knows how to choose, who has been given the space and the safety to practice choosing, is capable of building something that outlasts the worst that has been done to her. That was the lesson the Ashford School taught, every day, to every woman who walked through its doors. You are not the sum of what has been decided for you. You are the sum of what you decide next. Eleanor had decided, and it had made, in the end, all the difference. So Eleanor Ashford's story is a fictional one, but the truths it carries are not. In Regency England, and in many places still today, women's financial autonomy, legal standing, and personal safety were not guaranteed. They depended entirely on the goodwill of the people around them, and goodwill, as Eleanor knew, is not always where it is performed to be. The lesson Eleanor embodies is not merely a romantic one, though the romance is real and hard-won and entirely deserved. It is this: silence does not protect you. Documentation does. Community does. The willingness to speak plainly, without performance, in the presence of people who are willing to listen. That does. And the decision to turn your own suffering into something that prevents the suffering of others is not just noble. It is transformative. It is, in the truest sense, the difference between surviving and living. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, if Eleanor's quieter kind of courage spoke to something you recognize, then this channel will have done what it most hopes to do. Thank you for staying until the final word. If Eleanor's story found you, if something in it felt familiar, subscribe, because I have more stories like this one. Stories about women who survive and choose and build. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how far these women travel.